What's going on, Golden Bears? How are you? Hey, this evening's rendition is of the AMSCO Chapter 5 analysis questions and tips and suggestions. Starting off on page 2, says summarize the purposes of the First Continental Congress. Essentially, protests of the parliaments overstepping their bounds and this petition that they attempted to give to the king just to let things go back to normal, like they were before the 7 Years' War, kind of like the salutary neglect. The second question is what was the most significant act of this Congress, and defend your answer. Probably the endorsing the Suffolk Reserves, because that's just flat out rebellion, as they just seem to be asking for more and more favors. The next page asks what was the chief reason for colonial discontent just prior to the first shots. Well, the British rulers kind of were overstepping their bounds and forcing colonists around, not only just through physical moving them around using the redcoats, but also through taxes and the soldiers they quartered, etc. Explain how the fighting between British troops and colonists illustrated the cultural conflict that had evolved. Well, the divided colonists banded together against the British, showing tremendous amount of unity. The British looking down on those, even though they might have been losing some battles, as inferior colonists. On the next page is what was the most significant accomplishment of the Second Continental Congress, and defend your answer. Well, you got to remember the Declaration of Independence and how they adopted it, because these permanently divided the colonies, and Britain had set the course for war. So this declaration was the biggest step that came out of the Second Continental Congress. What was the most powerful argument by Thomas Paine for independence? And by the way, be sure to look through the end of the packet about quotes, etc. This is a huge tested item upon in this time period, especially Thomas Paine's common sense. So back to the question, it was against common sense for the continent of the United States to be ruled by a small, distant, unreasonable land led by an unreasonable king. So many utilize this idea that everyone should know about this small island and their inability to lead, and this is what gained followers and was really what made famous one of the famous scenes of the Schuyler sisters becoming entrenched in the whole Hamilton play. Going on to page 4, I believe it is, it says, explain how the American Revolution was essentially a civil war. Well, anti-British patriots fought pro-British loyalists, who often kind of pummeled and tormented the British soldiers. So you have the loyalists versus the who were both pro or against Britain fighting. What was the most common motivation for the American Indians and the African Americans fighting in the Revolution? Freedom! We're fighting for freedom. Why was the Battle of Saratoga the turning point? And this is a huge battle. You need to be aware of it. This is where the French joined the war, and Lafayette, singing that great song from Hamilton again, when the French joined the war. List 4 important reasons why the British lost the war. Well, many of the resources diverted from America, often because of the French intervention. Another one is that too many in the government of representing England, the Tories particularly, thought it was an unpopular war, and it was putting too much of a financial strain on those in Britain. Heck, the physical distance alone to the Americas was a logistical challenge, and a lack of response to this American guerrilla warfare that had emerged made it very difficult for the conservative and well-trained redcoats to fight back. List in 4 important provisions that the Treaty of Paris of 1783 provided. Number 1, it recognized the U.S. as an independent nation for Britain. The Mississippi would be the western boundary of the United States. Number 3, Americans had fishing rights off of Canada's coast. And 4, that the Americans paid their debt owed to the British merchants, and honored all the loyalist claims of land that was confiscated from them. Going on to page 5, I believe, explaining how the colonial era events influenced the creation of a new state constitution. Ooh, House of Burgesses is coming back again. Notice, said it would be there. This idea of a representative government used in the legislative branches of government. This was going back to Virginia and the 1607 time there of Jamestown. How did Roger Williams and his influence in Rhode Island is that he recognized the rights of the Indians and more than just the Christians, and extended this basic right to all people. It was like an early form of the Bill of Rights. So again, Roger Williams' early form of Bill of Rights. And how did John Locke and other Enlightenment thinkers theorize the relationship between man and government? Is that all people are given basic rights, and a list of rights such as religious freedom, limited central government, and their lack of interference in our personal and daily lives. The First Great Awakening is where religious freedoms became a standard basic right granted by constitutions that different states were proposing. Remember, the first light people who were opposing the old light were the big influencers in this shift. And what was the most significant accomplishment of the Articles of Confederation? And explain yourself. I'd have to say the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 set the precedent for letting new states in the United States. This also becomes a big boondoggle later on, but for the early part it works well. What was the most significant weakness of the Articles of Confederation? That Congress could not tax and thus could not raise needed money for the war debts or even running the country. And remember, in this newly formed republic, they want to make sure state rights, the rights of the individual, were respected over a tyrannical government that they had just came from. Going on to the next page, I think page 6, is explain how close the new nation came to ending slavery. Well, ending the importation and abolishing slavery in the North was a big influence, but the South had freed some slaves, but others just kept them fairly close to them. So only because of the influence on the North do we suspect it could have happened. And how close, the next question, explain how close the new nation came to gender equality. Well, extremely close during the war, as men were fighting and women took over many of their jobs. Much of this, sadly, reverted back to status quo after the war. And which came closer, racial or gender equality? I would suspect that gender equality, but it also regressed further than racial equality did when we began looking at what was happening after the 1860s. But that's in a different time period, so we'll leave that for another conversation. Going on to the American Revolution, the local context, we have the American Revolution was the uprising of colonists and against Britain to kind of secure their independence. What's the broad context? It is specifically significant because it resulted in the formulation of the first free nation, the United States, which had state-run legislators and governments with constitutions kind of determining each state's trajectory. And what's another context? But the creation of such a state is similar to the Haitian Revolution that we won't have much time to talk about until we get into the next time period. But this is where the slaves are freed and sent on a course of their own trajectory. Now on to the next section of that, I don't know what you want to call the document here. I'm taking a look at Thomas Paine's Common Sense. What's the historical context? Tensions were building, which between Britain and the United States, as the Continental Congress discussed what to do about the situation. The intended audience, the common person who was unsure of which position to take on the war. The purpose of this is to convince the colonists to separate from Britain. And a point of view is that America has been repeatedly, I guess, slighted or made less than by Britain and does not deserve to continue in this same course. Common sense would make this very clear and dictate this to the Americans. What else could we compare this to? You can maybe talk about Martin Luther King used this to convince people that a nation should not be as the way it was. Well, the rest of it you can do yourself. I hope you guys have a great evening, and go Bears.